Pollination. It allows us to grow the food that we eat and the gardens we walk through. It's necessary for our survival, and we would be doomed without it. You may have heard reports that the bees are disappearing, but what does that actually mean? Is there anything we can do to stop it? Is there any way to recover what we've already lost? In certain ways, yes. But first, for this video, we need to understand what pollination is and who pollinates what, because different species have different relationships. Pollination, by definition, is the transfer of pollen to a stigma, ovule, flower, or plant to allow for fertilization. In certain situations, plants can self-pollinate within a closed flower. However, the majority of pollination depends on pollinating agents separate from the plant, such as animals or wind. For plants that depend on animal pollinating agents, relationships have formed over time in which the plant provides something the animal wants, such as nectar, and the animal carries the plant's pollen to different plants of the same species. If pollination occurs across species, it's possible for hybrid offspring to develop. Horticulturists and farmers use this frequently to select for specific genes in plants. For example, the Asian pear cannot self-pollinate, but has been selectively bred by farmers over time. This is why they are so expensive when you see them in the store. In addition to their novelty, the care it takes to grow Asian pears is much higher than that of other produce. Once pollen has reached the target plant, there are two ways ovules can be fertilized. In angiosperms, plants that produce flowers and fruit, the pollen is first distributed to the stigma. The stigma activates, germinating and developing a pollen tube, which grows down the style until it reaches an ovary. The two gametes of the pollen grain travel down a tube to meet the female gametophytes in the carpel. The male and female gametes then combine. One male nucleus combines with the polar bodies, small haploid cells that are formed at the same time as an egg cell but cannot produce offspring, in order to produce endosperm tissues that surround the embryo and provide it with nutrition. The other male nucleus combines with the egg cell itself to develop the embryo. The combination of four gametes is called double fertilization and results in a fertilized seed with a protective coat and nutrients for the embryo, much like a chicken egg. In gymnosperms, plants that produce what are called naked seeds, such as conifers, the ovule is exposed on the surface of the support organ so that pollen do not need to penetrate carpal tissue. The most easily accessible example of this is a pine cone. The cone serves as a support organ for the ovules on the scales of the cone. There are two different modes of fertilization for gymnosperms, motile and non-motile. Cycads and ginkgo gymnosperms have motile sperm that swim to the egg inside the ovule. Conifers and gonidophytes, on the other hand, have sperm that are not motile and cannot swim on their own, but are instead brought to the egg through a pollen tube. Pollinators themselves come in all shapes and sizes. Abiotic pollination, meaning pollination not by an organism, refers to pollination by wind, water, or rain. About 20% of angiosperms depend on these non-living vectors of pollination. Because the plant doesn't have to spend energy attracting pollinators, they can dedicate more energy to the pollen itself, increasing its potency or its amount. Most abiotic pollination, about 98%, is anemophily, or pollination by wind. By studying plants that rely on anemophily, botanists and other scientists have determined that these plants have evolved to grow to specific heights at which their pollen is sent out, as well as more specific floral, stamen, and stigma positions to increase their pollen dispersal and efficacy. Hydrophily, or pollination by water, allows plants to send out pollen and, sometimes, entire anthers that travel across the surface of water. Sending out anthers is one way that plants are able to ensure that their pollen stays dry. Some plants that live in environments with heavy rain have developed processes by which they use that rain to transfer pollen. The excess rain drains along the plant, taking the pollen with it to the stigma. Pollination by rain splashing, or ombrophily, allows certain orchids to self-pollinate. When raindrops splash, the anther cap is removed and the pollen exposed. Raindrops can then hit that pollen, causing it to spring upward. The stipe of the plant pulls the pollen back down into the cavity of the stigma, and the seed is allowed to germinate. Depending upon environmental conditions, it's possible for plants to switch modes of pollination. Like the orchid in the example just now, Acampa rigida, when biotic pollinators cannot do their job, the plant switches to abiotic pollination. However, about 80% of angiosperms rely directly on biotic pollination. pollination using animals as vectors. Pollen vectors are organisms that carry or move pollen from the anther of one flower to the receptive part of the carpel or pistil of another. The majority of pollinators are insects, but birds and mammals contribute to the pollination as well. Pollination by vertebrates is called zoophily. In this category, there are two subcategories. Pollination by birds is ornithophily, typically hummingbirds, sunbirds, spider hunters, and honey eaters. Pollination by bats is chiropterophily, the highest frequency visitor to flowering plants being the fruit bat. Plants that depend on birds for pollination tend to produce lots of nectar and have red petals. Plants that depend on moths or bats for pollination tend to flower at night and have white petals with a strong scent. Pollination by insects is called entomophily. Plants pollinated through entomophily typically exhibit colored petals and strong scents. Entomophily has been traced back to the time of the dinosaurs and includes bees, wasps, ants, beetles, moths, butterflies, and flies. Certain species of bees, such as honeybees and bumblebees and butterflies, exhibit a behavior known as flower constancy, meaning that they are more likely to exclusively visit specific flower species or morphs within a species, even though there may be nearby available flowers with more nectar. This behavior, which results in a process called pollinator-mediated selection, puts selective pressure on floral traits. Flower constancy differs from other specializations by insects, such as innate preferences for color or flower type, and specialization due to positive reinforcement. In applied behavior analysis, positive reinforcement is a behavior modification technique used to selectively reinforce desired behaviors by presenting a desired stimulus after a target behavior is demonstrated by an individual. Positive reinforcement occurs in nature as well, and across species. Insects are more likely to visit flowers that are abundant and more highly rewarding. Because in the past insects have visited these plants and been rewarded, they will visit them again. Flower constancy is an adaptive behavior in that it prevents the loss of pollen during interspecific flights and reduces the likelihood that pollinators will clog stigmas with the pollen of incompatible flower species. However, this process is less likely to occur if pollinators have difficulty distinguishing the flowers. For example, if flowers are too similar in shape, petal number, and color, entomologists have observed a decrease in the behavior. When plants are dissimilar, flower constancy increases. This process is quite helpful for the flowers visited by the pollinators. However, it is not as helpful for the pollinators themselves. Flower constancy can draw pollinators away from flowers that may be more rich in nectar and often contradicts optimal foraging models. Optimal foraging models make the assumption that animals move minimal distances between food resources and will feed on a mixture of those resources in order to maximize their energy intake per unit time. While there is no concrete explanation as to why pollinators exhibit this behavior, hypotheses have been proposed, such as the memory limitation hypothesis, which posits that insects have a small working memory and can only identify and handle one flower type or species at a time. Some plants have evolved structures called pollination traps. These structures aid the trapping of insects to enhance the likelihood their pollen will reach a matching stigma. Pollination traps can be deep tubular corollas with downward pointing hairs, slippery surfaces, adhesive liquid, deceptive attractants, and flower closing. Many orchids produce chemicals that mimic female insects, attracting the males which intend to mate. Attracting pollinators is even more complicated than that, though, because of the day-night cycle. Plants that are pollinated in the daytime tend to have brightly colored flowers, and if they are pollinated by birds or mammals, their flowers tend to be larger and have larger nectar rewards than strictly insect-pollinated species. Flowers pollinated by birds and mammals also tend to spread the rewards out over longer periods of time and have longer flowering seasons. If a hummingbird were only able to access nectar from its preferred plant for a month out of the year, it would likely no longer be a preferred plant due to its lack of reliability. If the hummingbird drank the nectar from only its preferred plant for a certain period of the year, and the plant's flowering season shortened drastically, then it would likely starve. Therefore, plants that have longer flowering seasons are more likely to pass on their genes. Passing on genes is what pollination is all about. The flowers, insects, and mammals that work in these relationships are not the only ones who benefit from the process of pollination. We as humans need pollination to keep us alive because we eat the fruit and the vegetables that result from it. We also eat honey and eggs and use many animal-made products that only exist because of pollination. I hope you learned something new from this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe, or maybe comment your favorite new fact. Maybe take a look outside and see if you recognize any flowers or pollinators with characteristics I mentioned. I hope you have a wonderful day. Slán liv, agus go raibh maith agaibh.